Yeah, I am Gina Donahue, and this is Elevate the Conversation podcast. And I am here today with Luann Marlow, who is a lactation consultant and a pediatric nurse practitioner. So we're going to have a conversation today about challenges in breastfeeding and the overall health of a mother as she is trying to continue breastfeeding her child. What are some of the issues or problems that women can run into with breastfeeding, and then what are some of the solutions? And so I'd like to have Luann introduce herself and explain how she approaches lactation consultation and her journey from being a pediatric nurse practitioner into this really specific field.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be talking with you today, Gina. So my journey, I started out as a pediatric nurse practitioner. I always knew I wanted to be a nurse and a nurse practitioner. I actually started out in oncology, pediatric oncology, so that's a very different transition. I had my first baby. I knew everything about pediatrics and nothing about being a mom and nothing at all about breastfeeding. And I think that's kind of surprising for moms sometimes, that their healthcare providers don't know anything about breastfeeding. Mm-hmm. So I had my first baby. I took lots of classes about having a baby, delivering a baby, but nothing about breastfeeding because I thought that would just come naturally. And I think people still think that. And so I had this first baby and had no clue how to breastfeed a baby. I thought, it's just going to happen. It's a natural process. And within about 24 hours, I was like shocked that that was not the case. And I was still in the hospital, and the nurse came in, and I was like holding this baby, like struggling. He was not latching well, and I actually had bleeding nipples. And the nurse walked in and looked at me and said, "Well, you're obviously not doing that right." And she took the baby from me and put him in the bassinet and walked out of the room. And I started crying because, I was a hormonal first-time mom, and I was thinking, I'm a failure. I'm a nurse practitioner, and I don't know how to feed my baby, and I don't have another plan. And I was just sitting there like shocked. And I don't know how long it was, but somebody else came in, I don't know if she was a nurse or a lactation consultant. I don't know who she was, but she came in and she was like, "Oh, honey, dry your eyes. Come on, bring the baby. Come with me." And we left the room and went somewhere else. And she helped me latch him on. And within minutes, he was feeding well. Everything was fixed. It was like all was right with the world. And I thought about that experience for a long time, that here were two very different people who should have been able to help me. Mm-hmm. One who, made me feel like a failure, and one who changed my entire experience. And I kept that experience with me for a very long time. And throughout all the teaching that I did, I thought, I never want another mom to have that same experience that I had. And so in helping and all of the types of nursing that I did, I always kept that in the back of my mind, that this is the right way to help people and this is not. But I always kept that breastfeeding experience in my mind because that was such an important experience to me. And I went on to breastfeed 4 children and enjoyed that experience so much. And so I always helped my friends and helped other people, and then I had a variety of jobs as a nurse practitioner, but I always kept coming back to that, and it was always just so important to me. And so it kept kind of getting woven into the jobs that I did, and then I just realized that was really my love. Mm-hmm. And so I kept getting more education and more experiences, and I kept kind of coming back to lactation, and that just became really important to me.
So I would like to share a little bit about my own experience as well. So I also, with my first child, who's now 24 years old, I did all the things. I went to the class. I learned how to give birth to a child. It's interesting because the person who taught my class was a midwife, and she sold breast pumps. But after I had my son, the advice was you can get a breast pump when you're ready to go back to work. But my experience was I made milk right away. I got so engorged that I got mastitis. My son was like drowning in my breast milk. And I can remember being up in the middle of the night over the sink trying to figure out how to manually milk my breast. I've never been, and it was so painful. And I wish that I would have known that for some mothers, having a breast pump before you give birth to your child is a great idea, so that if you happen to be one of those women who produces a lot of milk, that is liquid gold. Pump that and stick it in the freezer. All of that just made me sick and eventually got resorbed. And I also really struggled. I always tell women I had a natural childbirth, and it hurt, but then the pain was over. Breastfeeding for me with the first one was more and more and more excruciating, to the point where, you know, my toes would curl every time he would latch on. It was so excruciatingly painful, and you have to keep doing it every couple of hours. And then I was bleeding, and it never was as sore with the other two children as it was with the first one, but it was painful.
And I think people give you this message that, well, it's just supposed to be that way,
natural,
and you're just supposed to, you know, endure that. But that's not normal, and that's when, you know, someone should tell you, reach out for some help. And there's plenty of help, and people aren't given the resources, you know, to say, hey, here's someone who can help you. Go to that person.
Right.
So like for me, you know, they're in the hospital, instead of this person saying, oh, honey, you know, that's not normal, let me get somebody to help you. You know, it was just this, oh, you're not doing that right, you know. And then someone can come along who can fix that just like that. Or maybe not. Maybe it's a longer journey, but you have someone to walk by your side. And, you know, I hear people's stories all the time where it's like, oh my gosh, this was a miserable experience. And I'm like, my heart aches for you, because it doesn't have to be that way. And, you know, it shouldn't be that way. And I'm just like, I hear this terrible advice that people get, and I hear their stories.
What are the bad? What's the bad advice that you hear?
Oh my gosh, I just. So a mom told me this week that in the hospital they told her, just stick the breast in the baby's mouth while he's crying, and just wait until he stops. And I was like, okay, that's never going to work. For one thing, we don't stick a breast into a crying baby's mouth, and a crying baby is never going to feed. So, you know, you have to have a calm baby, and we don't stick a breast in a baby's mouth. We bring a baby to the breast. So, you know, babies have reflexes. You know, we know those babies' reflexes. They have primitive reflexes. Those are designed for feeding. There's survival reflexes. What does a baby have to do to survive? He has to feed. So he has reflexes that are designed to bring him to the breast. But, you know, you're taught to lean over the baby and stick the breast into the baby's mouth. That doesn't work. But you bring a baby to the breast, and all of his reflexes will actually bring him into a feeding position, and he can feed himself. Nobody's taught to do that.
Right.
And so I'm like, why would anyone tell you to stick your breast into a crying baby's mouth and wait till he stops crying? Is he going to do that?
No, probably not.
He feels like
suffocate.
Suffocating.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, oh my gosh, I just have this list of crazy things that people are taught. And this mom was like, well, that didn't seem right to me either. Like, no, it's not. So, crazy stuff.
So what are the most common issues that you see just with women in general with advice that they're being given with breastfeeding? Like, what is your guidance for women now?
Let's start at the very beginning. So I think a lot of women feel like they have to have a lot of milk from the very beginning. And so supplementation starts very early. but you don't have to have large volumes of milk. It takes a while for your milk volume to increase. You start making milk during pregnancy, but it's not until the placenta is delivered that your volume increases. But babies' tummies are tiny, like this big, and so that's all a baby needs is just that colostrum, because babies are learning to suck, swallow, and breathe, and that's a complicated process. And so if you're overwhelming a baby with large volumes of milk, they can't learn to suck, swallow, and breathe. So your body's designed to give babies tiny little amounts of milk, the amount that your body's making, those little, like a teaspoon of colostrum at a time. So babies need to feed very frequently, but they only need that little small amount. But a lot of moms are being told, you don't have enough milk, we should give your baby, this formula in the hospital. And that sets women up for a sense of failure. Oh, I don't have enough milk. I don't have enough milk. I think a lot of that starts with a lot of deliveries are induced these days.
Yeah.
And so when you get when you get an induction, you get a lot of IV fluids. When you get those IV fluids, babies get those IV fluids too.
Yeah.
And so when the baby is born, the baby's then diuresing. They're having, a baby should have one wet diaper that first day. Well, if your baby has like 6 wet diapers, they weigh the baby the next day and it looks like the baby's lost a lot of weight. Well, where'd they lose that weight from? Those 6 liters of IV fluids you got. So when they look like they've lost all this weight, everybody jumps into this panic and they're like, oh, your baby's losing weight, you don't have enough milk. Well, you weren't supposed to. And so they want to jump in there and start giving the baby supplements in formula. And already the mom is like, I don't have enough milk. Well, it takes on average 3 to 4 days for your breast milk volume to increase. So you're not even supposed to have that milk yet. But if a mom is just trusting herself and putting the baby to the breast very, very frequently, every 1 or 2 or 3 hours, that baby's going to get the milk that they need. But these interventions, the inductions and the C-sections and all that that moms are getting are leading to a lot of problems. So the most frequent thing that I see are inductions that are really long, that then end up being a C-section, that then ends up delaying milk production, and babies are getting, formula, and then it's a very long process, and then it's just like this spiral of bad things happening.
And babies are coming out medicated too, and so that's another issue.
Very much
I think
so.
To be mindful of is a baby may, if you had a spinal or you had some kind of medication to help with delivery, which you may need, that there's nothing wrong with having that, but it's important to recognize that baby got the medication too, and so baby may not latch on right away.
And a baby may be very stressed. If you had a really long induction, that baby may be very stressed, and that baby's going to come out very sleepy or not wanting to feed well, or what I see a lot is their reflexes aren't working very well in the beginning, and so they don't suck or swallow or breathe very well. And it takes a little while for that process to start working. And if your baby needs to be supplemented, that's fine. But we need to support that process, and that may take a little while to start working. That's the most common problem that I see. The second most common problem I see is that social media, while it can be good, can also cause a lot of misconceptions on what's normal. And so right now, the big popular thing is breast pumps and pumping. And so moms are starting to pump really, really early. And while we want to have a good milk supply, what I'm really seeing now is an oversupply of milk. The more milk, the better. And that's not actually true. So more milk is not actually better, and more milk can be very difficult for a baby. So if you have too much milk, then that causes a lot of forceful flow, and babies are choking and gagging and can't, handle that extra flow of milk. Your breasts are very, very firm, and a very firm breast is a very hard breast for a baby to latch onto. And so then they're getting advice of, oh, you just need a nipple shield because the breast is so firm and the baby can't latch on. And that's like very difficult for a baby and for a mom. And they're just pumping more and pumping more and pumping more and pumping more. And you have this freezer full of milk that they're then having to turn back around and supplement to the baby because the baby can't latch on. And I have a lot of concerns about your natural breast, anatomy and causing this extra supply of milk and what that's going to do to women's breast in the long run, because your breast is not like this empty bag that we're just filling up with milk. It's a gland with glandular tissue, and we're actually causing this extra production, and that's not a natural thing. So on down the line, what is that going to look like?
Yeah, well, I would actually even wonder what that does for mom's overall health, because baby is more important than mom is to a certain extent. And so what kind of osteoporosis risk is she at later? Mm-hmm. What kind of oral health risk is she at later? Down the line, what are her hormones? How are her hormones being affected?
Right. I mean, it's a big demand on your body to produce milk. And I think about other glands in your body, like your pancreas and your thyroid. We're not pushing those glands to overproduce like that. Your body's not designed for that. And if you have 2 babies, your body can make more milk. If you have 3 babies, your body can make more milk. But to push your body to make more milk like that, over and over and over again, I'm just not. I wonder about the health of the mom for that.
Yeah.
And then there's just a significant time crunch. It's very time consuming to pump and pump and pump and pump like that. And you have a baby too. And it's very exhausting.
Yeah.
But there's this idea that this is what you're supposed to do. You need all this milk.
So that's what's happening in social media right now. So that's what moms are being told.
Big push to have all this extra milk. And oftentimes what we'll see is that becomes, that pumping ends up being so difficult that the moms end up exclusively pumping because they can't feed the baby at the breast. And that wasn't their goal. They just were trying to make sure they had enough milk.
Yeah.
So that's a big problem that I see. And then the other side of that is the low milk supply. And sometimes that's true and sometimes that's perceived. So, you may not have enough milk, but sometimes you just think you don't have enough milk. And sometimes that's a pumping issue too. So you're pumping milk and the amount of milk that you get, you think is not enough. And so you think, I don't have enough milk because I didn't pump enough milk. But the amount of milk you pump isn't necessarily an indicative of the amount of milk you're making. So that may be a pumping issue.
Well, and the other thing too that I think is so amazing is that the amount of milk that you may need to make, your body knows what your baby needs.
Right.
And so maybe you're not making as much volume, but you're making very rich milk. Mm-hmm. The beauty of just trusting the breastfeeding process is recognizing that when you are breastfeeding your child, your body knows sometimes better than you what your baby needs because they're communicating with each other. And trust and not parenting from a place of fear.
Right. And there is a lot of parenting from a place of fear. And there is a lot of distrust in your own body. And because breastfeeding, although is not new, there were several generations where moms did not breastfeed.
Right. I'm a product of that.
Right.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of physicians who don't know a lot about breastfeeding because there were several generations where breastfeeding was not the norm. And so that wasn't taught. And so the information about feeding is based on formula feeding.
Yeah.
And so when you look at feeding, we're thinking bottle feeding. And bottle feeding and breastfeeding are very different.
Yeah.
The mechanism for that, the volumes for that are very different. Babies bottle feed very different than they breastfeed.
Yeah.
The idea is that bottle feeding is easier than breastfeeding, but it is not.
No.
And it is actually much more difficult for a baby to feed from a bottle, and babies take a lot more volume from a bottle than they do from the breast.
Yeah.
But when you look at that bottle, that you think, oh, a baby has to take this amount, and then you're comparing that amount to what you see when you pump, or what you see when a baby takes, the amount that you pump from a bottle, and you can't compare the two. Breast milk and formula do not compare in volume.
Right. So women, we often can feel like they're comparing their breast milk supply to what's being given in formula. And so they're parenting from this real place of fear. And I did just want to talk for a minute about the fact that in a lot of my podcasts, one of the overarching conversations is just the effect of stress on the body.
Absolutely.
Because I have a lot of people who come in here and they're focused on their gut, or they're focused on their thyroid, or they're focused on their hair loss, or their weight gain, or their sex hormone balance. And so that's often what prompts people to come in. But when I sit and I listen to people's stories, even though they don't realize it, I hear, honestly, the physical effects of chronic stress. And I know, obviously, I've had 3 children. I've breastfed 3 children. And so being a parent is hard. It is stressful. I've always been, I guess, a person who has relied a little bit on my innate wisdom and my innate knowledge. And so as maybe I've gotten a bit frantic with not having people available to help me answer questions, I've tried to come back to, well, what's the natural way that things should be functioning, and is this going in the natural way? So, I managed to make it through being a parent, but it's very stressful. And so I'm curious about your take on the stress that you see in parents and how you think that may affect their milk supply. And so that's one thing that I wanted to talk about. And then can you talk a little bit about mom's stress and then baby stress? Because another thing that I really talk quite a bit about is trauma. And there's a lot of trauma that we may suffer as infants that we don't remember anymore, but from our mother's or parents' stress, it's one of the sensations that we were aware of as an infant. And so can you talk a bit about the interplay?
Oh gosh, there's so much here.
I know, that's a lot.
So I want to go back to this part where you said the part about your innate, like the natural kind of way. And I think the whole reason that I started my business, Dream Baby Cafe, and where I got that name was I felt like when I was doing, general pediatrics, and I've done a variety of things from childhood cancer. I had a clinic in a homeless shelter. I worked, with children with brain tumors. I did primary care. I've done all kinds of things. But one of the things that was a common theme through all of that was crisis.
Yeah.
And all of those parents were in crisis. But I ended up in newborn nursery because one of my own kids was in crisis and I needed an easy job. And what I found was that wasn't so much an easy job, but I fell in love with that job. And I realized that, even these new parents are in crisis.
Yeah.
And it was like all the same, whether you had a child with cancer or you had a newborn baby, it was still a moment of crisis. You're like, what do I do in this situation? And I felt like, well, I was really good with people in crisis because I could help kind of take them from this moment to like finding the next step. Like, here's the next step. And the bridge for that was education. If you just had a little bit of education, you could take that next step. And the thing that I found about these new parents was they didn't have that natural sense of like how things were natural. And I think what was missing there was people don't live near their families anymore.
Yeah.
They don't have that sense of community. Whereas it used to be everybody lived in a community, your mom and your sisters and your aunts, and everybody all lived, in the same neighborhood, all lived in houses all by themselves. And so you saw your relatives have these babies, birth these babies, breastfeed these babies, grow these families, and you had the experience of watching that and knowing how to do that. But people don't live like that anymore. I don't live near my family. I raised 4 boys and my family lived far away, and I did that all by myself. And when I didn't know what to do, I didn't have anybody to turn to.
Yeah.
And I felt like I had to figure that out on my own. And I saw that these moms were doing that too. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to change a diaper. They didn't know how to give a baby a bath. They didn't know the basics of childcare. And they certainly didn't know how to breastfeed, and they didn't know where to turn, and they were turning to Google. And then now they're turning to Instagram and TikTok, and they're getting their information from strangers.
Yeah.
That they are becoming their social support network.
Yeah.
And they don't have that sense of connection. And they feel lost.
That's what I have often said to women who I know who are having children is this is the one time in life where you realize that we really are social creatures.
Yeah.
Because the baby is going to come out.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's nothing you can do to prevent the baby from coming out. But breastfeeding, there is nothing natural about breastfeeding. That is a learned behavior.
Yeah.
And my mother didn't breastfeed.
Right.
And so, I kept hearing stories about how my brother and I slept through the night from the time we were like a week
Oh,
old.
boy.
And it's like, well, my children didn't sleep through the night until they were 3 or 4 years old. I mean,
And
I wasn't breastfeeding them until that long, but it's just, it's different.
Right. It is very different. And there are all these expectations that are coming at moms that they're learning from social media, and we all know what you're seeing on social media isn't exactly what's happening behind closed doors in people's homes.
Right.
And there's a big sense of isolation when you have a new baby. It's exhausting.
And so how does that stress out the moms? Like, do you think that affects their milk supply or their ability to have the baby latch? What do you think?
I think that yes, absolutely. I think that, here you're trying to figure things out. You're all by yourself. You feel very isolated. There's this sense of, when you're pregnant, you have this idea, this is what's going to happen. You have this dream of this is what's going to happen. And then all of a sudden, here's reality. And you're like, this isn't what I thought it was going to be like.
This is hard.
This is really hard. And then you don't know if this is supposed to be this hard. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there's this guilt because you're like, maybe I shouldn't think this is this hard. Maybe I'm feeling ungrateful. And then for some moms, this is very, very hard. I work with some moms that are really, really struggling with feeding their babies. And they have a goal and they want to breastfeed really badly. But it is really, really hard. And they are really, really struggling. And they're doing this all alone. And sometimes it's so hard, and there's this guilt of I'm not doing this right, or if I just tried harder, or they're getting all these messages from other places, and then they're seeing people that seem to be doing this really easily, and they're exhausted, and they're maybe there's postpartum depression, maybe there's not, maybe they're just tired and it's just really hard, and there's a tremendous amount of stress in that.
So how do you help them? What do you, as a lactation consultant, how do you help them?
I think I try to give them a plan that will work for them. Mm-hmm. So I can give them a plan, and I can say, hey, this is what we're going to do. You're going to put the baby to the breast, and then you're going to pump, and then you're going to give the baby a bottle, which is triple feeding, which is very difficult. But then we have to have I have to say, is this something you can do? And this has to be a short-term plan. This is not something you can do forever. but we have to say, is this something you can do? And we have to have an end point here. Or we have to say, is there something else that we want to do instead? Is there, is this your goal? What is your goal? First of all, it's not my goal. So what is your goal? And here's the end point here.
End point of what? End point of a transition or
ending? And this is how long we think this is going to take to reach this, and then we're going to reevaluate, and then we're going to see what we're going to do next. You have to support that emotionally. One thing that I noticed recently was you can get really so fixated on this plan and this goal, and everything else can just it's like this is your whole thing, and everything can start to look very negative. Nothing's working. My baby's not able to do what he's supposed to do, and my body's not able to do what I'm supposed to do, and nothing is working well, and I can see that. It's like everything is hard. It is hard. And then you just become in your own little bubble working so hard at this. And I think moms need support.
And so you're supporting them. So when you say that there's an end point, you mean an end point for the transition to where then hopefully
things
baby's
are starting to work,
and things are working.
Things are starting to work.
The end point
and
is
I think sometimes if that plan is too hard and no one is supporting them and they're not seeing that there's an end point, it's very easy to just give up.
Right. So your goal is to keep mom breastfeeding, keep baby working at the breast.
Right. Yeah. And to say, here's what our goal is.
Yeah. So I think we're going to have another podcast at some point because there's so much to talk about, especially like with, what is it, tongue tie? Or
tongue tie.
I mean, there's so many things. But right now for moms, I think, really focusing on moms. So talking about support. So the social support is so necessary for moms, whether it's your first, your second, your third. So I think there can be a lot of self-blame and shame if you've done this before and you're having a different experience with another child. But talk a little bit more about the specific support that you offer. I don't know how many women really would think to reach out to a lactation consultant. So talk a bit about what it is really that you do and how you being a pediatric nurse practitioner sort of influences your knowledge base and your ability to provide support for mom and baby when they're struggling.
Okay.
Because I love that.
So I think what I do that may be a little different than, some other people is because I have this pediatric background, I can look at kind of the whole situation. I'm not just looking at, I'm looking at this breastfeeding, situation. But I can see, kind of a bigger, broader view. And, when I do an assessment of the mom and the baby, I'm doing a lot of like what you do. I take that whole history. I go back to pregnancy. I go before pregnancy. And I'm looking at the mom's whole health history. I'm looking at, did you have any trouble getting pregnant? How did your breast develop? Did you have any difficulty with your periods? I want to know her hormonal history.
Those are my questions.
Exactly.
Yep.
Because I might send them to you.
Yeah.
Because that's important. I need to know. Yeah. Do you have adequate breast making, milk making tissue? And then we're going, step by step by step. I'm looking at, she might tell me what she's coming to see me for, but that might not be the whole thing. And I'm starting at the very beginning. And I'm looking at that baby as well. And I'm looking at not just, babies don't just feed with their mouth. Babies feed with their entire body. So I'm looking at that baby's reflexes. I'm looking at that baby's body tension. I'm looking at that baby's oral function. I'm doing a suck assessment on that baby. If that baby's not latching on well, there are a lot of reasons why that might be. And I'm looking at that whole thing, and I can put all that together, and I think that really gives me an advantage. I'm also, able to say, what, this might not be a breastfeeding issue. It may be the baby looks like he might have a cardiac issue, So there's just a lot of, background information that I can bring to the table there.
Yeah.
And then I may be able to say, you know what, I think that this mom needs to see a specialist. And then I'm working with them, and helping to learn what her goals are, because they're not my goals, they're her goals.
Exactly.
And then we can talk about what are your goals and what do you want to work toward. And because I can take that health history, then I'm able to say, these are the problems that I think that we have, and this is how we're going to address them. And I may need to pull in someone else. I'm a collaborator. I don't feel like I have to solve all of your problems.
Right.
And I don't have any problem reaching out to someone else. In fact, I'm going to best serve this mom if I can say, you know what, I don't think this is my area of expertise, but I'm going to bring someone else in who I do feel this is, the expertise. And particularly, I've become really interested in those moms who just cannot make milk. And because they've been told by, their pediatrician, well, some moms just can't make milk, or they're obese. Some moms just can't make milk. And I don't buy that. You were designed to make milk. Your baby was designed to breastfeed. So if there's an issue there, we need to figure out why. And so I've really been looking at, okay, we've done all the things we need to do, and if we're just not able to get that milk supply up, there must be a reason why.
Yeah.
And so I've really been looking into that, which is how we connected.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, okay, if we've got some hormonal issues or some metabolic issues or some reasons, some issue here, then we need to delve deeper into that, and that's where we need to connect with someone like you who can draw labs or look more into the medical aspects of that, and so that's a connection there. But the other thing that I think has really been missing for these moms is the social support, and I think that's a big piece that's been missing. Recently, I was working with a mom who her baby has a tongue tie. I see a lot of babies with tongue tie because I have tongue tie specialization, and that's can be a very long, drawn out process to getting that baby to feed well. And this mom was really working hard, but it was a very hard process. And sometimes in that process, you can only see the bad. You can just see that they're just not making progress. They're just not making progress. They're working really hard, and you just feel like it's a struggle. And in this process, the mom had a family trip. And so she took a week off, and they went to visit some relatives for a family occasion. And when she came back, she was almost like a different person.
Oh.
And I was like, wow. And she was so excited, and she was telling me about this trip and the family that she had seen, and there were all these relatives, cousins and sisters, who all had babies about the same age.
So they could share stories.
And she was sharing stories, and she was able to compare her baby to these other babies who were about the same age. And instead of seeing the struggles that her baby was having, she was able to compare that her baby was doing the same things as other babies were doing. And then one other relative's baby had some struggles that her baby was having, and she was able to share some tips that she had learned and help this other relative. And they all were just like stopping and breastfeeding their babies at the same time. And she came back with such a light in her eyes. And I was like, even though things can be really hard, if you've got that network of people that you can share it with, it changes your entire perspective.
I had a friend. I was pregnant at the same time as a coworker when I worked at UCLA. She was about 3 months ahead of me. So she had her son first, and then I had mine. And both of our boys were breastfed, and they both were early birds. They would wake up before the sun. And, waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning every day after you've had interrupted sleep, after months. Until he was over a year. He was just an early riser. But I had my friend Susan, and I don't know how I would have stayed sane, because 5 o'clock in the morning, I could get up and be with Lucas out, and I could call Susan and she'd be awake.
Right.
Because Liam was awake. Mm-hmm. And I I don't know how I would have made it if I didn't have that friend at that time to go through those struggles with. 'Cause it is really exhausting, but it was such a support, to go through that together.
They want the joy of the breastfeeding experience, and sometimes it can be really hard, and I think having that group experience helps them to find that joy of breastfeeding that they really wanted.
Yeah, because you do tend to idealize things, and the reality is when you wake up 3 or 4 times a night and you're breastfeeding, it's hard. But I do think, I know we have to wrap up here, but I also just did a lot of learning, studying myself, and what I learned from a book called Nighttime Parenting, which changed my life, is that the mother's sleep pattern will change to mimic the baby's. So the way that we sleep, I don't have it memorized now, if it's like, deep sleep, REM sleep, light sleep. I don't remember the sequence, but adults have a different sequence of sleep than infants. But when you start breastfeeding, your sleep pattern changes to be that of the infant, so that you don't become homicidal and kill the little thing, because you would literally not stay sane.
Well, the magic about breastfeeding is when you breastfeed your baby, your body releases oxytocin.
Yeah.
Which is a stress relieving hormone, but it also gives you a sense of calm, and if you give in to that, if you close your eyes and you rest, which is what oxytocin is designed to do during those breastfeeding experiences, you get those little bitty naps throughout the day. And if you're breastfeeding your baby 8 times a day, you get a little 30-minute nap 8 times a day, which is what it's designed to do, to help you to get that rest, so that it makes up for those times that you're feeding during the night. But most people don't do that.
Yeah.
They're on their phone, or they're, on Instagram, and that actually is like an antagonist to your oxytocin.
Right.
But if you use that in the right way, it helps you to get that rest that you need.
Yeah.
Because that oxytocin is designed to help you rest and relax, and decreases those stress hormones in your body. It's a magic.
It is magic. So I really appreciate you coming, and I think we're going to definitely have to have multiple conversations.
So many things we could talk about.
So many things. But what I love is that your approach to lactation facilitation is that it's really a holistic and comprehensive look at mom and baby as a unit and as individuals. And with your pediatric nurse practitioner experience, it's just such a special knowledge base to bring to the table in order to be able to help mom and baby. And you're looking at it from, I would say, a functional perspective, which is what, of course, I appreciate, since I also take a functional approach to just overall health. And what that really means is, how was your body designed to work?
Right.
And if it's not working that way, why not? So you're doing root cause lactation consulting.
I ask that question all the time. Why?
And
why is this not working?
Yes, and so that's just a really beautiful thing. But you don't necessarily only have to see mothers that are struggling. I'm certain that you are happy to see all mothers.
I feel like every mom needs a lactation consult. I like to see moms for prenatal visits, because we can look at what might be an issue before a problem starts.
Yeah.
But I think every mom should have a lactation consult.
And your website is
Dream Baby
Cafe.
DreamBabyCafe.com.
Yes. So Dream Baby Cafe. And this was Luann Marlow. So thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. This is really nice. And we could talk about 1,000 things. So we will definitely have to do this again.
And thanks for joining our conversation today. I hope that this was helpful to new moms.
Thank you.